What if I told you the version of Little Red Riding Hood most grown-ups know ends with no rescue at all? The image lands hard because it collides with everything we learned as children. A bright red hood, a kind grandmother, a gallant hunter swinging in at the last instant to cut open the wolf and free the girl. It's a tidy, reassuring ending, one that reassures us about predators, about rescue, about the world being set right before lights out. But that ending is a later invention. In Charles Perrault's 1667 printed tale, which is one of the oldest widely read versions in the modern European canon, there is no hunter, no cutting of the wolf, and no reprise of safety. The girl is swallowed. Period. The moral is not about bravery rewarded, it is a moral addressed directly to young women about the dangers of naïveté and predation. That gap between the grim contours of older recorded forms and the softened shapes we now recognize lies at the heart of what I want to show you today. Under the banner, The Harsh Truth Behind Fairy Tales, we're going to trace how a set of stories once told in taverns, by hearths, and in public squares, stories that often dealt in the most uncomfortable realities of life, came to be framed as children's bedtime consolations. We'll look at three tales closely: Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and Donkey Skin, including a Brazilian variant called Dona Labismina, and we'll follow each through its recorded incarnations, its variants, and the social pressures that remade it. Along the way, we'll talk about how folktales are cataloged and dated, why original is a misleading word in folk studies, and what it costs a culture when it polishes away the hard edges of its stories. First, a short note on sources. If you want the editions, scholars, and studies whose names I'll be dropping, Perrault's 1667 Tales of Mother Goose, the Grimm's 19th century collections, Maria Tatar's work on fairy tale reception, the Arne Thompson-Uther ATU Index, and a 2015 phylogenetic comparative study that tried to map deep lineages of tale types, check the pinned description for links and a reading list. I'll flag anything uncertain as indefinito and attribute claims where necessary. Scholarly humility is part of the argument here. Stories, not originals. To get anywhere with this material, we need to begin with a corrective. There is no single original fairy tale. That's not a denial of history so much as a discipline, a refusal to mistake the point of collection for the point of origin. Folk tales are oral, mutable, and transmitted by people. Each telling alters a tale slightly. Each listener reshapes it. The versions we read in books are snapshots, fossilized moments where a collector decided to transcribe or publish a particular telling.
The Arne Thompson-Uther Index, the ATU, is a cataloging system that groups tales by recurring motifs and plot skeletons, assigning them numbers so folklorists can follow migrations and transformations across time and space. It's a useful organizational tool, but it is not an origin story. Consider an analogy: dialects. A dialect map might show where speakers of a certain set of words cluster, but it can't point to the single moment when a phrase first appeared. Folk narratives operate the same way. Sometimes a variant will be old enough that we can say it's among the earliest recorded appearances in a given linguistic or geographic area. Sometimes comparative methods, linguistic, textual, or even computational phylogenetics, can suggest deep affinities. But the word original invites a mythology of purity that the transmission of these tales never sustained. How tales enter print matters. Charles Perrault published in 1667 for an educated Parisian salon, an audience that expected wit, aphorism, and a moral. The brothers Grimm, publishing in the 19th century, were working partly from the impulse to recover what they saw as a national German cultural patrimony. Their editorial choices reflect that era's romantic nationalism. Hans Christian Andersen, writing in 19th century Denmark, was a novelist poet who often transformed folk motifs into personal, authorial tales. Each collector's context, social, political, economic, inflects how a tale looks on the page. The collectors and their motives. Charles Perrault, France, 1667, did not think of his Tales of Mother Goose as an ethnographic project. He wrote for salons where aristocrats exchanged witty stories and moral aphorisms. Perrault's audience expected lessons, and his framing often made the moral explicit. A tale could be entertaining while also instructive. In Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood, the didactic sting is obvious. The girl's error is not entrusting a grandmother, it is entrusting adult men who present themselves as harmless. Perrault seals the story with a moral directed to young women.
The tale as Perrault prints it is already a printed, politicized version, a version edited to register certain social anxieties for a particular class. The brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, collected in a very different atmosphere. Working in the first half of the 19th century, they were motivated, at least partly, by nationalism and by a romantic idealization of rural German culture. Their first edition of Children and Household Tales, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, appeared in 1812. They continued to revise and expand later editions. Initially, the Grimms were folklorists in the sense of compilers, but they gradually altered texts, sometimes correcting or smoothing language, sometimes inserting Christian moralizing, and sometimes polishing away the rougher edges that publication for a broader family audience demanded.
Their editorial practices evolved as they sought to make folk culture legible as national heritage. Hans Christian Andersen occupies a third mode, the authorized transformer. Andersen borrowed motifs from oral tales, but reworked them into individual narratives infused with his voice, often melancholic and personal. Andersen's tales are not raw folklore. They are literary treatments that reflect 19th century sensibilities, including concerns about modernity, urbanization, and individual subjectivity. These collectors are not villains. Each operated within particular social and commercial economies that shaped what they published. Perrault catered to a courtly salon, the Grimms to a rising print market with nationalistic undertones, Andersen to a readership that expected imaginative, often moralized stories. Understanding their contexts helps explain why a tale that once circulated in gruesome or ambiguous forms ends up neatly tied. Oral mutability and publishing constraints. Oral tradition thrives on flexibility. A storyteller adapts details, names, settings, even central plot points to the audience and the moment. A tale told by a widow in a famine-struck village will emphasize different elements than the same tale told in a coastal trading town. That elasticity is the strength of the folk tradition. It keeps a narrative relevant. It also makes tracing and original impossible in any definitive sense. When these flexible tales encounter the fixity of print, change happens again. Publishers want clearer morals, stable plots, and predictable endings. Books must sell. For tales aimed at younger readers, market pressures push editors toward gentleness. The 19th century saw the rise of the child as a sentimental, protected figure in Western bourgeois culture. That changing social ideal demanded narrative adaptations. The tales did not simply lose their cruelty overnight. Editors, teachers, and parents actively reshaped them to fit new ideals of childhood. Methodologies, cataloging, dating, and the limits of inference. To study fairy tales rigorously, folklorists rely on comparative methods and cataloging devices. The best-known tool is the ATU index, which groups tales by type. For example, the Little Red Riding Hood structure falls into ATU type 333, while Hansel and Gretel relates to ATU 327A, children and ogre/cannibal witch motifs, and Donkey Skin sits within the category of The King Wishes to Marry His Daughter, a motif with a range of international occurrences. The ATU gives scholars a shared vocabulary to say, these plot elements, abandonment, cannibalistic antagonist, recognition by token, appear together often enough to be treated as a recognizable type. In recent years, some scholars have borrowed tools from evolutionary biology, phylogenetic methods, to see whether they can trace deeper lineages of tale types.
A 2015 comparative study applied statistical models to a wide sample of tales, attempting to reconstruct probable relationships and age estimates for certain motifs. The study's headline implication was that some tale structures might be very old, perhaps millennia in gestation. That's an exciting claim, but it requires caution. Phylogenetic approaches model changes in tales in ways analogous to genetic mutations. They rely on coding motifs as discrete characters and then use algorithms to see which tree of relationships best fits the observed variation. The method can reveal clusters and suggest likely ancestral states, but its conclusions depend heavily on sampling choices, on how motifs are coded, and on assumptions about transmission. In other words, phylogenetic models are tools, useful for hypothesis generation, but not final proofs. When the method points toward deep antiquity, we should hear that as an interesting possibility couched in assumptions, rather than as a settled fact. Where evidence is skin or ambiguous, mark it indefinito. With those methodological caveats in place, we can move to our first close example, Little Red Riding Hood.
This is the tale that exposes how a story about vulnerability and predation was turned into a moralized vignette for polite society, and then later remade into a child-friendly rescue plot. Little Red Riding Hood, Perrault to popular culture. We start with Perrault's 1667 printed version. His tale is concise. A young girl, famous for her red cap, goes to visit her grandmother bearing a basket. Along the way, she meets a wolf, who, through flattery or cunning, learns her destination. The wolf arrives first, consumes the grandmother, dons her clothing, and waits in bed. The girl arrives, remarks on the grandmother's strange appearance, and the wolf devours her as well. The tale ends with a pointed moral. Young women who are too trusting of strangers, who stray from caution, bring ruin upon themselves. There is no hunter, there is no reversal. Perrault's closing moral is explicit. The story is meant to instruct. Perrault's version was hardly the only emblem of the tale in circulation. Italian variants, such as those gathered in Neapolitan traditions, introduce further intimations of adult predation. In some of those versions, the wolf's meal becomes a grotesquerie of domestic consumption. Meat placed in a pie, wine poured in a goblet. The predator's feast is staged with culinary details that underscore the wolf's function as an adult sexual predator, not merely a wild animal. Those details amplify the story's subtext. The wolf stands in for predatory adult men who groom and devour the innocent. Why would such stark images arise in oral cultures? One dominant interpretive frame sees tales as public attempts to process social anxieties.
In pre-modern Europe, young women, especially those without strong family protections, faced very real dangers: sexual exploitation, early marriage under coercive terms, and social penalties for perceived impropriety. A tale that dramatizes the consequences of misplaced trust is not simply prurient, it's a survival lesson couched in storytelling. Folktales frequently encode practical warnings: beware the stranger, don't accept gifts from unknown men, don't wander alone at dusk. Horror functions as pedagogy. The Grimms and the Rescue. By the time the Grimms began compiling their tales in the early 19th century, the cultural politics of childhood had shifted. Many readers wanted tales suitable for children. The Grimms' later editions show an awareness of a juvenile readership and the moral anxiety of parents. They began to alter texts, sometimes smoothing language, sometimes adding Christianized reflections, sometimes modifying dangerous outcomes. In the case of Little Red Riding Hood, the Grimms appended an ending in which a hunter or a woodcutter discovers the sleeping wolf and cuts him open, freeing the girl and her grandmother alive. In some retellings, stones are sewn into the wolf's belly. The wolf awakens, tries to flee, and collapses. The redemptive ending reassures danger has been neutralized, and virtue or cleverness is ultimately rewarded. The rescuing male figure reintroduces a patriarchal order that restores safety. Interestingly, the addition shifts the tale's lesson. Instead of a personal moral about female sexual prudence, the story now supports the idea that community or masculine intervention can rectify wrongs. It's worth pausing. Adding a hunter changes the tale's function. Perrault's version ends as a cautionary warning. The Grimms' later version ends as a communal parable. That single editorial move altered how generations of readers would internalize the narrative. And once a tale settles into print with a rescue, it becomes easier to adapt into forms that insist on comforting endings: stage shows, children's books, and eventually animated films. Variants beyond France and Germany. The tale's variants are diffuse. Scholars have found similar predator and innocent motifs across Europe and beyond. A tricky wolf, a disguised predator, a meal that is actually a trap. Some versions foreground sexual danger, others emphasize simple trickery. In some Eastern European traditions, the predator is not an animal at all, but a person who uses craftiness to deceive. In others, the story functions as an initiation narrative. The girl's removal and return represent transitions from childhood to a guarded adulthood. The persistence of the token, something like the red cap, deserves attention. The red hood is a conspicuous signifier. Color, clothing, and familiar tokens are small narrative artifacts that locate a tale in social reality. Clothing marks social standing, age, and visibility. A red hood makes a child noticeable.
That visibility is part of the caution. Being conspicuous in a dangerous social world invites attention. At the same time, clothing gets reread and aestheticized in later adaptations. The red hood becomes an icon, merchandise-ready, a costume. This is one way a tale migrates from protective warning to commercial symbol. Why sanitization happens. The trajectory from Perrault's hard moral to the Grimms' rescue to modern child-friendly retellings is not accidental. Several forces push in the direction of gentleness. First, shifting ideas of childhood. In early modern Europe, children were not always seen as precious, protected beings. They were economic actors, heirs, laborers.
As modern bourgeois norms emerged, children were revalorized as objects of sentiment and cultivation. Literary markets responded. Second, commercial imperatives. Publishers and illustrators wanted larger markets. Books for children with threatening endings sell differently than those that conclude with restoration and comfort. Parents, especially middle-class parents with time and money, bought books that reflected and reinforced their aspirations for their children's psychological welfare. Third, pedagogical aims. Educators sought to use literature to teach morals in ways consistent with evolving ethical frameworks. A story that ends with uncomplicated punishment and adult restoration fits neatly into such curricula. Fourth, nationalizing impulses. For the Grimms, making tales part of a German cultural corpus required smoothing multicultural or rough edges that did not fit the image of a pure, folk-born national literature. All of these pressures converge to produce versions of stories that are safer for public consumption. The cost is not merely aesthetic, it is interpretive. When editors scrub away violence or ambiguity, they often remove the social context that gives a tale its teeth. A story that once warned of sexual predation or of hunger now becomes a narrative about individual virtue rewarded by providence. What the older versions still tell us. It matters that brutal or disturbing elements were part of older recorded forms. These elements tell us about the environments that produced and transmitted the tales. Violence, abandonment, and taboo in folk narratives often reflect real social stressors. Famine makes abandonment narratively intelligible. Predatory adults make cautionary tales necessary. Family instability gives rise to stepmother tropes that encode anxieties about blended households. Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood, with its unmitigated ending, is not simply a morbid curiosity. It's an example of a narrative that performs social caution. The story's harshness is functional. It trains listeners to recognize danger and to respond with suspicion in a world where legal and social protections were uneven. When literacy is rare and institutional protections thin, stories become one means of social instruction.
Because the tales were adaptable, they also allowed different communities to insert localized warnings. That is why across far-flung regions, the bones of a story remain recognizable, even as its surface shifts. A closer reading, Perrault's rhetoric. Perrault's text does another important thing. He attaches an explicit moral. That rhetorical move clarifies the intended audience. It is not a generic warning for people as a whole. It is addressed to a particular social subject, young women, who must navigate a world filled with flattering and dangerous men. Perrault's moralizing completes the tale's function. It converts a compelling narrative into actionable advice, albeit in a stylized literary form suited to salon speech. Perrault's audience, educated, conversant in etiquette, would read this moral as a pointed commentary about courtship, reputation, and the perils of sexual display. The tale becomes a vehicle for a social lesson that matters in that milieu. From cautionary tale to commodity. Fast forward 2 centuries, the grim endings are less marketable. The 19th and 20th centuries see the rise of children's literature as a distinct market segment. Publishers looking to sell widely aim for stories that reassure, that model moral progress without unmitigated horror. The Hunter's late intervention in the Grimm's revision is commercially serviceable. It gives readers a redemptive payoff, a satisfying moral closure. Disney's later mid-20th century transformations represent the endpoint of a long trend. In the popular imagination, Disney crystallized the sanitized, aesthetically pleasing version of many tales. This is not just aesthetic smoothing, it is also a franchise-friendly decision. Comfort, romance, and easily merchandisable characters sell toys, music, and film tickets. Once a tale is recast as romance and rescue, it becomes a cultural asset easier to monetize than a story that warns about the predatory behavior of adults within a supposedly safe domestic sphere. From comparative notes and the deeper past. Before moving on to the second tale, it's useful to step back and consider how scholars think about the deeper past of motifs like the predatory adult. The ATU Index links Little Red Riding Hood to a wider family of trickster or predator tales. Comparative work identifies equivalents across Europe, Asia, and Africa, suggesting that humans in many places use narrative to model interpersonal danger. A 2015 phylogenetic comparative study suggested that certain tale types could be ancient, surviving across millennia in modified forms. That claim invites wonder. Could the structural logic of predator deceives innocent persist across vast temporal spans because it addresses recurrent human conditions, child vulnerability, asymmetries of power, and sexual danger? Remember the caveats. Computational phylogenetics relies on chosen datasets and coding schemes.
It can point to probable relationships and help us see patterns, but it cannot tell us with absolute certainty what a storyteller told in the Bronze Age or where a particular motif first appeared. When the method yields deep time estimates, treat those estimates as compelling possibilities rather than as sealed truths. When evidence is sparse or ambiguous, mark conclusions as indefinite.
Closing the Little Red Riding Hood section and looking ahead. If we take one lesson from the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, it's this: the presence or absence of a rescue redeploys the story's moral axis. Perrault's harsh ending sharpens a social warning. It can point to probable relationships and help us see patterns, but it cannot tell us with absolute certainty what a storyteller told in the Bronze Age or where a particular motif first appeared. When the method yields deep time estimates, treat those estimates as compelling possibilities rather than as sealed truths. When evidence is sparse or ambiguous, mark conclusions as indefinite. Closing the Little Red Riding Hood section and looking ahead. If we take one lesson from the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, it's this: the presence or absence of a rescue redeploys the story's moral axis. Perrault's harsh ending sharpens a social warning. The Grimm's later revision reassures a readership invested in community remedy. The tale's endurance shows how narrative can both reflect and shape social norms. Versions without rescue teach vigilance. Versions with rescue teach faith in communal or paternal restoration. We've spent a good stretch grounding Little Red Riding Hood in its social and editorial contexts, because it's a clear example of how print and market pressures can reframe stories. Up next, we will move from predation to hunger, into the world of a house made of sweets that tricks children into becoming a meal. Hansel and Gretel most explicitly encodes the social crisis of famine, parental abandonment, and the wild survival strategies of children. It is a tale about the collapse of familial responsibility and the children's resourceful reversal of fate. The witches and gingerbread are the flashy surfaces. The bottom line is hunger and the social structures that produce it. Before we go there, one final reminder. If you want the exact editions and studies I've been referring to, Perrault's 1667 Tales of Mother Goose, the Grimm's Collections, Maria Tatar's critical editions and commentaries, the ATU Index, and the 2015 Comparative Phylogenetic Study, check the pinned description. I'll list primary texts and a short bibliography so you can read the older variants yourself. When we return, we will step into a forest of hunger, neglect, and cannibalistic threat. But we'll also ask a harder question. Why does the figure of the stepmother so often shoulder blame for social abandonment? And what does that tell us about gendered anxieties in the societies that told Hansel and Gretel? The answer will require us to look at historical famines, property rights, and the cultural logic that transforms an economic crisis into a moral tale. If the harsh truth behind fairy tales has caught your attention so far, subscribe and leave a comment about which tale you grew up with that surprised you most. Full sources and further reading are linked in the description below. Now, imagine a pair of small footprints trailing into the deep, cold woods. They are light at first, nothing more than a child's step, but they mark the beginning of a narrative that refuses to let us look away. They step gingerly, then faster, 2 small footprints pressed into leaf litter that leads away from everything the children once knew. That image holds the whole point of Hansel and Gretel: absence, hunger, and the sudden responsibility forced onto the young. The tale begins in the most elemental human register: food. The house of sweets is spectacle, but hunger is motive. To read Hansel and Gretel as a mere children's fable is to miss the economy behind the spectacle. The version most of us recognize comes from the Grimm's Kinder- und Hausmärchen, first published in 1812 and revised across subsequent editions. The Grimms tell of a wood, of parents driven by fear and privation, and of 2 children led into the forest, abandoned or allowed to wander away, depending on the variant. They find a cottage made of sugar and cake, are lured by a witch, and face the very real danger of being eaten. They outwit her, the oven becomes the instrument of her destruction, and return home, pockets full of treasure, to a household transformed by the death of the stepmother, or, in some readings, by the reconciliation with the father. When we slow the tale down, its contours look less like a moral nursery rhyme and more like a documentary sketch of social collapse. Why would caregivers abandon children? Why does a witch offer deadly hospitality constructed of domestic foods? Why is the oven the fulcrum of reversal? Each element points us to material conditions and cultural anxieties. Abandonment and famine, historical context, and interpretive caution.
Scholars who read Hansel and Gretel sociologically inevitably turn to concrete historical pressures. Pre-modern and early modern Europe experienced periodic famines, food scarcity, and precarious subsistence economies. In communities where survival was barely secured, parents sometimes faced life or death calculations about feeding the household. Folk tales can encode those dire choices in narrative form. The abandonment motif acts as a symbolic substitute. The literal act of leaving a child in the forest becomes, in narrative terms, the visible sign of communal scarcity and moral distress. We should be careful about asserting direct causation, that a certain famine caused the Grimm tale. That is indefinitive. Oral narratives rarely function as single, direct records of a specific event. Instead, they assemble cultural anxieties, hunger, social shame, and intergenerational blame around symbolic plots that make them legible. Hansel and Gretel translates the practice and fear of scarcity into a story whose emotional logic is immediate. Hunger produces danger. The most domestic of spaces, food, home, become perilous. Children must rely on cunning to survive. Who bears blame? One of the most striking shifts across variants and editorial decisions concerns who is responsible for the abandonment. In the Grimm's early editions, the mother is often the instigator.
Later, as readers and editors grew more sensitized to moral judgments about parental roles, the stepmother increasingly becomes the villain. That editorial move matters. Turning the blame to a stepmother allows a narrative to keep the father as a sympathetic, if impotent, figure, one who is overwhelmed by circumstance rather than actively cruel. Why the stepmother? There are several cultural logics at work. First, stepfamily dynamics were fraught in pre-modern societies, where inheritance, resource distribution, and child-rearing intersected with survival economics. A biological mother's willingness to harm her children is harder for audiences to accept. A stepmother, by contrast, fits into an older literary and folkloric trope of the wicked stepmother who threatens property and emotional security. Shifting the moral burden onto a stepmother preserves a plausible domestic order while personifying social anxieties in a recognizably antagonistic figure. Another reason for the editorial change is marketability and moral discomfort. When collectors hoped to shape tales for family consumption, they preferred villains who could be clearly rebuked and removed. Making the stepmother the villain supports that moral clarity. It also fits 19th century patriarchal sensibilities. The father, even when unable to provide, is not framed as the transgressor. That editorial rebalancing is not an innocent act. It shapes how generations of readers understand familial responsibility and gendered culpability. The Witch's Kitchen and the Politics of Cannibalism. The Witch's Gingerbread House dramatizes a terrifying reversal, domesticity as a trap. Foods that nurture become instruments of entrapment. Food symbolism here is rich and unsettling. The witch's home is a feast that hides predation. Cannibalism, explicit in many variants or bluntly implied in others, operates as a metaphor for social consumption. Adults consume the labor or the future of the young in times of crisis. Cannibalism in folktales is rarely only literal, it is often an emblem of exploitation. Look at the methods of escape. Hansel's trick with the bone, or later editions' tricks with pebbles, and Gretel's counter-move at the oven are acts of resourcefulness. The children use intelligence and domestic tools against predation. The oven, symbol of home labor, becomes the site of the witch's undoing. That inversion is not random. It dramatizes a reclaiming of domestic means by those whom society would normally render powerless. The children's survival is not a deus ex machina. It is a narrative of agency in the face of institutional failure. International variants and motif clusters. Hansel and Gretel is catalogued within ATU Type 327, which clusters tales involving children and cannibalistic antagonists. Variants appear throughout Europe, and the motif of children abandoned by parents in times of scarcity recurs in different cultures.
In some Italian versions, for example, the method of escape or the shape of the threatening house differs, emphasizing local foodstuffs or domestic devices. The core motif, children, food as bait, and a predatory adult figure, remains resilient. The cross-cultural persistence of the motif suggests that these tales respond to universal conditions, childhood vulnerability, and adult asymmetries of power, or at least to common structural pressures in pre-industrial societies. The 2015 phylogenetic comparative study I mentioned earlier treats clusters like ATU 327 as candidates for deep antiquity, narrative structures that endure because they model recurrent social predicaments. Again, that kind of dating is a probabilistic inference, not an archaeological certainty, but it helps scholars think about why certain story skeletons keep reappearing. Editorial smoothing, the Grimm's revisions and modern adaptations. The Grimm's revised Hansel and Gretel across editions.
In earlier versions, the abandonment is more stark and unsentimental. In later versions, the story is polished toward a more palatable, even triumphant ending. That editorial hand did cultural work. It allowed the tale to be read in family parlors as a story about cleverness rewarded, rather than as a narrative about systemic neglect and hunger. Modern adaptations often further domesticate the story. The witch becomes a clear antagonist, often ugly, insane, or supernatural, rather than a potentially human figure who might embody social exploitation. The focus shifts to the children's cunning and the spectacle of the candy house. The structural critique of scarcity recedes. Animations and picture books downplay parental complicity, and in doing so, make the tale safer for consumption. The cost, again, is interpretive. A story once capable of articulating the moral complexity of poverty is retooled into one that emphasizes individual heroism. Small but telling variations. A quick look at variant details shows how mutable the tale's affect can be. In some rural tellings, stones in Hansel's pocket are replaced by breadcrumbs that birds eat. That small substitution makes a huge narrative difference. With pebbles, the children can find their way home, which introduces a note of providential luck. With breadcrumbs, their navigation fails and they are subject to fate. Different tellers emphasize different moralities, prudence, fate, ingenuity, depending on context. Why Hansel and Gretel endures. The tale survives because it does what good folk narratives do. It encodes a social lesson in a memorable plot, while allowing variation so that audiences can adapt the lesson to their immediate concerns. In rural settings where the danger is material and immediate, the tale can function as a stark warning. In settings where childhood becomes sentimentalized, the tale reconfigures itself into a narrative about bravery and reward.
That elasticity is the genius of folklore, and also why we should resist the temptation to fix any one version as definitive. From hunger to taboo, donkey skin and its kin. If Hansel and Gretel dramatizes scarcity and abandonment, donkey skin, French pot à carries us into the unnerving domain of incestuous desire and the tactics used to escape it. Perrault's version, appearing in the French tradition in the late 17th century and circulating in multiple folktale forms, tells of a king who, when his queen dies, decides to marry his own daughter. The princess resists, sets impossible conditions, dresses in impossible fabrics, and a dress made of the hide of a magic donkey, and finally flees, disguising herself in the donkey skin to hide her identity. She finds work in a distant court, loses a token, a ring, a piece of cake, or, in some variants, a ring and a pastry, and eventually is recognized and married by a prince. Perrault's donkey skin is literary and stylized, but it draws on motifs that recur across Europe. The combination of incestuous taboo, impossible dress tasks, flight in disguise, and recognition by token makes the tale both psychologically intense and narratively satisfying. It tackles the worst of social anxieties, a father's transgression, the collapse of protective structures, and the need for a daughter to navigate a world where family is no longer safe. Across regions, variants shift emphasis. In Northern Europe, motifs of magical assistance or animal disguises appear. Consider Alilero, a German tale with a similar skin disguise motif. In other areas, the incestuous component is attenuated or reinterpreted. The suitor becomes an unwanted marriage proposal from a non-familial suitor, or the king's desire is framed as a misreading of a vow. Those changes often correlate with editorial discomfort. Collectors who wish to market stories to a broader, often younger audience tended to soften the incest angle. Dona Labismina, a Brazilian inflection. To see how the tale adapts across cultural contexts, consider Dona Labismina, a Brazilian variant included in some Brazilian folktale collections. In Dona Labismina, elements familiar to Bodaan appear: impossible demands, magical garments, flight, but the tale incorporates local cosmologies and narrative textures, serpentine helpers, etiological flourishes, for example explaining particular sounds of the sea or a local custom, and different family dynamics shaped by colonial and indigenous social histories. The name Labismina itself hints at a serpentine helper or figure, drawing on local imaginative resources to mediate the heroine's escape. Dona Labismina shows 2 points clearly. First, the core narrative, danger at home, costly tasks, disguise, and recognition, travels. Second, local inflection matters. The means of aid, the nature of disguise, and the final social reconciliation reflect culturally specific imaginations of power and survival. Readers who encounter the Brazilian version and the French version will notice both family resemblance and striking differences. That duality is the hallmark of folkloric transmission. The ring in food token and recognition motifs. One of the most mobile elements across donkey skin and related tales is the recognition token, a ring dropped into food, a lost slipper, a ring in a cake. The token allows an anonymous figure to be discovered by a prince or an authority who can restore social order. Functionally, tokens perform several rhetorical jobs. They dramatize fate or providence, they restore identity and social rank, and they provide a neat ending that resolves the moral disorder created earlier. Notice how the token often involves food or domestic contexts, rings and pastries, messages baked into food, or tokens concealed in household objects. That pattern reminds us that in many folktales, social identity and domestic economy are intertwined. Food is not merely sustenance, it is a medium for recognition, betrayal, and restoration. Why donkey skin is awkward for collectors. For editors and collectors, donkey skin is a headache. Incest is an uncomfortable motif for a literate middle-class audience that sees itself as morally upright. Publishing a story where a father seeks to wed his daughter risks scandal or moral confusion. Consequently, many printed versions either sanitize the incest into a king seeks marriage with a too precocious daughter, or recast the father as an ambiguous suitor whose motives are reinterpreted. Other versions emphasize the heroine's resourcefulness and disguise, turning the story into a romance of escape and eventual reward. Beyond sensibilities, there is also narrative economy. The tale's darker undertow challenges the neat moral closure many readers crave. A heroine who survives by disguise and deceit complicates models of virtue favored by some pedagogical traditions. So editors often adjust emphasis, reward the heroine's cleverness, but downplay the structural horror that necessitated her flight. Comparative threats. What ties the three tales together? Step back and compare the three case studies. Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and Donkey Skin, and certain patterns emerge. First, a recurrent use of domestic imagery as danger. In each tale, food, clothing, or home space flips from nurturing to dangerous. The grandmother's bed becomes a trap, candy and cake become lures, a donkey skin becomes protective disguise. Domestic objects are charged with ambivalence. Second, the centrality of tokens and recognition. From the red hood to pebbles to rings and food, small objects anchor identity and narrative resolution. They allow stories to dramatize memory, visibility, and social belonging. Third, the gendered shape of anxieties. Each tale stages fears about female vulnerability and male predation in distinct ways.
Perrault's Red Riding Hood warns young women about adult male seducers. Donkey Skin dramatizes a literal breach of paternal authority into erotic territory. Hansel and Gretel implicates adults who fail to protect the young, and, in some versions, specifically targets maternal or step-maternal figures. These motifs reflect social structures where gender, sexual control, and property intersect. Fourth, tales as pedagogical tools. Whether the message is beware predatory adults, be resourceful when institutions fail, or preserve honor through modesty and flight, these stories functioned as ways to teach survival strategies and social norms. They are not morality plays only, they are encoded social instructions. Fifth, editorial and commercial reshaping. Across the board, the movement from harsh variants to softened versions follows similar pressures. Changing notions of childhood, commercial markets for children's literature, and nationalist or aesthetic projects that valorize certain kinds of cultural heritage while excising uncomfortable materials. Methodological aside, ATU, motifs, and phylogenetic models, a clear but compact explanation. We've used a lot of comparative language, the ATU numbers, phylogenetic talk, but it's worth laying out plainly what these tools do and don't do. The Arne-Thompson-Uther Index is essentially a catalog. It groups similar narratives by recurring motifs and plot skeletons. This cluster of elements tends to appear together, so scholars treat it as a type. The index helps researchers say, this tale belongs to this family, which is useful for mapping diffusion and variation. It does not, by itself, tell you where a tale originated. Phylogenetic comparative methods borrow from evolutionary biology and apply algorithmic models to coded narrative data. Think of motifs as characters. Their presence or absence in a set of texts can be used to calculate which family trees of descent best explain observed variation. These methods can be illuminating. They may show that certain motif clusters cluster together geographically, or that particular structural features appear to predate others. But they depend on sampling choices, coding decisions, and assumptions about transmission, so conclusions are probabilistic, not definitive.
When a study proposes deep antiquity for a tale type, read that as a hypothesis supported by modeling choices rather than a sealed historical fact. Finally, there is the hard evidence problem. Folktales are oral. Before printing, we rarely have reliable timestamps. Literary versions anchor things in time, but they are moments of editorial selection. So the best practice is to triangulate. Use textual evidence, comparative distribution, historical context, and cautious modeling to build plausible narratives of transmission, always flagging uncertainty when necessary. The cultural cost of sanitization. Why should we care that tales were hardened and then softened?
Isn't it kinder to let children enjoy harmless stories? There are two responses. First, sanitized tales are not neutral. They teach different lessons. When Perrault's uncompromising Little Red Riding Hood becomes Disney's reassuring rescue, the moral shifts from an emphasis on vigilance toward a confidence in external rescue. When Hansel and Gretel's hunger plot is smoothed into a candy house spectacle, the story stops being about systemic failure and becomes about individual captive versus hero triumph. These shifts influence how cultures imagine responsibility, blame, and the proper response to danger. Second, sanitization is an act of cultural erasure. It removes the historical substrates, the concrete anxieties about famine, exploitation, and familial abuse that made the tales meaningful. That erasure has consequences for historical memory. If we no longer recognize that a tale once functioned as a public form of instruction about survival, we lose a window into the everyday pressures that shaped people's lives. That said, the impulse to protect children is understandable. Institutions and parents often want stories that reassure. The ethical question is whether we can preserve openness about the past without needlessly traumatizing the young. Scholarly attention does not require gratuitous exposure. It asks for contextual honesty. Knowing that tales were sometimes harsh gives us a richer, more honest view of cultural life. A few practical takeaways. If you read or teach fairy tales with an eye to cultural history, consider these simple practices. Read variant pairs aloud. Juxtapose a sanitized text with an older recording. Let listeners feel the difference in moral emphasis and ask, what does each version want its audience to do? Preserve context. When you present an older version, add context about why certain motifs might have mattered, famine, inheritance, punitive social mores, without sensationalizing. Feed curiosity. The ATU Index and accessible scholarly syntheses, Maria Tatar's commentaries, annotated editions of the Grimms and Perrault give good starting points. For technical readers, phylogenetic studies are fascinating but interpretive. Read them as methods, not as final verdicts. The harsh truth behind fairy tales, what it ultimately means. If there is a thesis here, it is this. Fairy tales are not museum pieces of infantile innocence. They are social technologies, mutable, contested, and deeply responsive to the material realities of those who told them. The harsh truths embedded in many older versions are not mere sensational decorations. They are legible signs of social stress, gendered tension, and the constraints of life in environments where institutions were unreliable. To study these tales responsibly, we must do three things at once. First, we must respect the textual record, cite the edition and place of recording, and avoid treating any single printed version as the original.
Second, we must read variants comparatively, noting how motifs shift according to local needs and editorial pressures. Third, we must contextualize morally disturbing elements within social history, not to excuse them, but to understand why they functioned as they did. Those methodological habits preserve both scholarly humility and interpretive clarity. They allow us to say that Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood, the Grimm's Hansel and Gretel, and Perrault's Donkey Skin, and the Brazilian Dona Labismina share structural logics, and that those logics illuminate historical anxieties that matter for understanding the past and our relation to it. If we simply flatten those narratives into soft entertainment, we lose access to an important form of cultural memory. If we sensationalize them, we disrespect the lived realities that made the stories useful. The balance lies in careful reading, acknowledging the tale's capacity to frighten and instruct, and remembering that their transformations reveal as much about the collectors and markets that reshape them as about the communities that first told them. Where to go next? For readers who want to investigate further, start with the primary editions, Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose and the Grimm's Children and Household Tales, alongside annotated modern editions by scholars such as Maria Tatar, who provides translation, context, and sensible commentary. For comparative tools, consult the ATU Index and motif catalogs.
If you are curious about computational approaches, look for the 2015 phylogenetic study on folktale dating. Read it as an innovative method that opens questions, not as an unequivocal timeline. Full references and links to editions, commentaries, and key studies are in the description below. The tales still speak. These stories endure because they meet human needs. Sometimes they are literal survival guides. Sometimes they are moral cautions. Sometimes they are symbolic therapies for societies under strain. The versions we read as children are often the palatable end products of long processes of selection, sanitization, and commercial viability. Knowing that history does not make the tales less valuable, it makes them more interesting. It invites us to listen more carefully, to notice shadows where we once saw only satin, to hear warning tones beneath lullaby melodies. We started with a stark contrast, the Red Hood we know and the no rescue ending in Perrault's version. We followed 3 stories through their recorded lives, tracing hunger, predation, and taboo, and we saw how editorial hands, market forces, and changing ideas of childhood remade them. The harsh truth behind fairy tales is not a polemic against modern adaptations. It is an argument for historical honesty and interpretive nuance. Fairy tales tell us about the worlds that told them. To soften them is often to soften our understanding of those worlds.
If this exploration surprised you, if it made you look again at a story you thought you knew, tell me which fairy tale you'd like unpacked next in the comments. Subscribe if you want more long-form dives into folklore, literary history, and the uneasy lessons our cultural inheritance keeps. All primary texts, scholarly works, and the studies I mentioned are linked in the description below. Follow those links if you want to read the older versions yourself. Thanks for sticking with this deep dive into the tough edges of stories we thought were soft. The tales survived because they answered hard questions. Paying attention to their harshness is a way of honoring that survival.